Welcome to the second video looking at the India and China synoptic materials. This one's going to focus on the consequences of China and India's continued growth. Now, in terms of answering a question like this, it's worth thinking about that consequences is a word that isn't necessarily negative. In that sense, it's very neutral, so it's important that you consider the positives as well as the negatives. And what we're going to do is talk through the synoptic material, try and identify a number of positive consequences, and then have a look at some of the negatives. And some are a bit more complicated, but we'll cover those as we go. Okay, so let's get started. Probably the sensible place to start is with economic growth. Now, there's a nice figure here, figure 12, which shows you projected increases in terms of increase in GDP. And you can see that China basically skyrockets. India, on the other hand, is increasing still fairly rapidly, but not as fast as in comparison. Now that's a massive increase in GDP, that means more geopolitical power, but it also means presumably more taxes, more revenues, and with that can come in a huge amount of investment. Now there is a word of warning, we'll look at this more in the third part when we look at the sort of threats to economic growth, but these are very much predictions, and it's worth being aware, particularly have a look down here, that actually the gap between the highest and the lowest prediction is actually only is 300%. So you've got to take these with a pinch of salt. But actually, one of the consequences, massive increase in GDP. With that, presumably, comes a massive increase in investment. Now, one of the reasons why that extra money, that GDP, that tax revenue, and that investment is important is because as the country gets richer, it will be able to invest more. And if we have a look, what we can see, say figure 6 for example, which talks about this idea of a social progress index, India in particular has a lot to invest. Just having a look at these figures, we can see that it's got some fairly fundamental issues that it needs to address. Sanitation, shelter, coming down here, ecosystem sustainability, even health, and we know about India's multiple health risks. All of these things will improve with greater investment. China also going to benefit from this, but you get a feeling that looking at this data, India is the country with the bigger issue here. And remember, we talked about this data earlier, and we'll come on to personal rights and democracy a little later on as a possible consequence. Now, an interesting area where there's going to be consequences is in India's policy, sort of pro-poor government policies, for example. Now, as it becomes more global in its trade, as it wants to break down trade barriers with other countries, presumably one of the consequences for that is that it will have to then change its policies on subsidising its farmers and putting tariffs and barriers in place for other industries. If that happens, it's more likely then to have to adopt a more neoliberal view, and in fact the current Prime Minister is actually in the process of doing that. So one of the issues here is what happens around subsidies. If India ends up cutting back subsidies, so basic needs such as food, subsidies for agriculture, energy, etc., is it the very poor that suffer? Okay, and it's quite a sizable amount here. We're talking $60-odd billion, 15% of government spending. Now, if it does have to implement neoliberal policies, then what's going to happen is those subsidies are going to be removed. The barriers that are preventing TNCs coming into India will be removed, and India becomes more of the part of the global economy. Consequences of that is that Indian industry may well, and its TNCs may well flourish, and you may have more powerful and more Indian TNCs. But, at least in the short term, the poor are going to suffer from the removal of those subsidies. Indian business, which is basically used to having a domestic market that it can exploit without competition, will struggle in the short term. And that means they may well see unemployment and at least in the short term, greater poverty. Neoliberals would argue that as business becomes more effective, it will earn more money, that then will create more jobs, and in the long term, that will create benefits. But it's a really interesting sort of discussion to be had here, which if you're going for the A, you can really get your teeth into. And again, if we have a look at these figures, what we can see is a very similar sort of picture. You would expect the benefit being, particularly for India, there to be a massive increase in the number of TNCs as it becomes more globalised and part of the world trade system. You'd also, though, expect to see greater opportunities for these TNCs to actually come in and invest. Now, there's also another issue here, which is China, which is what's going to happen to these state-owned enterprises. Does increasing globalisation of trade mean that these state enterprises have to shut? That's something we'll look at more in detail in the third video, but again, it's a possible consequence. Now, one of the most important negatives in terms of consequences that's likely to happen is the increase of conflict. And that conflict could be both international, which is what we look at here, but can also be national, and we'll look at that in a second. But if you look particularly at the rise of China's spending, what you see is that China is rapidly becoming the second most powerful military in the world. Although at the moment it's not in a place to actually challenge the US spending of 640 billion, it's about a third of the size at the moment. It is increasingly becoming more interventionist. A good example of this is the South China Sea. And if you look at this map, what you can see is a complete and utter mess at the moment. Okay, you've got China, you've got Taiwan, you've got the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, all of these countries making claims to disputed islands in the South China Sea. And we're seeing at the moment the militarisation of this, including China building military bases on coral islands. Now, if you think that China is only going to become more and more powerful, only going to spend more military, then actually the potential for international conflict in this zone massively increases. Now, one of the reasons behind this, by the way, is that it's believed there's large amounts of oil and gas in this area. So, again, this links to possible issues with energy insecurity. You've also got to think about this idea of a blue water navy. Blue water navy is a navy which is able to project power overseas in oceans, etc. And in particular, two things are important here: the nuclear power submarines and aircraft carriers. And again, with this investment here, China is moving from a large military army-based, personnel-based army to a smaller but more sophisticated army. And you would expect that with that will come the ability to project power far more effectively. And with that will come those submarines and in particular those aircraft carriers. So again, a real issue here, real flashpoints, serious issues here that need to be addressed. Having said that, the United Nations does have mechanisms by which these types of disputes can be resolved, and it may actually be resolved peacefully, but it's very much a hot potato at the moment and needs watching. Now, having considered international conflict, it's worth thinking about domestic conflict, internal conflict. And in particular, it's worth thinking about China here. Now, what's interesting is you can link in modernisation theory here. Now, modernisation theory, the most famous proponent of this is Rostow, and I'm sure you would have seen his economic development models. Now, that in itself isn't actually particularly relevant to democracy and things, but other modernists, and the key player here is a guy called Parsons, believed that as countries went through these steps, they would also not just become economically more developed, but become socially, politically, and culturally more developed. And by developed, what modernists meant was like America. And actually, if you have a look on figure 7, you can see that there is at least a suggestion of a correlation between increasing GNI and increasing economy and increasing democracy. Although, as I think it points out down here, you take South Korea, which is the richest economy in Southeast Asia, that actually went for a military dictatorship for the best part of 20 years. But by the time you got to late 70s, early 80s, its growing middle class, its wealth that it had generated, actually led to a situation where the military dictatorship didn't feel it could actually maintain power, and there was actually a peaceful transition towards democracy. China, if you have a look, is very much a bit of an outlier. At the moment, it's the fourth wealthiest country in Southeast Asia, but the least democratic. And it's worth just thinking about a little bit of history here. If you go back to 89, then actually you've got the last time there was a significant challenge to the Communist Party's power, and that led to Tiananmen Square. Basically, a large number of students camped out in the capital while Gorbachev was visiting. He was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. As soon as he left, the tanks rolled in and large numbers of people were killed, arrested and disappeared. Since then, there's been a sort of unwritten agreement between the Chinese government and its people that the Chinese government will deliver rapid economic growth and development. In return, the Chinese people won't question the party state. Now, there is a question here, which is if you continue to have economic growth and you continue to have a rising educated middle class, are they going to be prepared to enter into that deal? And there's a real issue here about potential issues, conflicts, or again, is it like South Korea, a peaceful transition to a multi-party democracy? Certainly that's something to consider here in terms of consequences, but we'll also come back to it when we think about opportunities and threats. Now, a big issue regarding consequences is the consumption of resources. If you have a look, China and India already consume vast amounts of the world's resources, which is not surprising considering that there's the best part of 2.5 billion people in those two countries alone. But if we look, what we actually see is that they're already consuming something like 48% of the world's rice. They're consuming somewhere in the region of 20% of the world's timber. Something like, well, certainly more than 27% of the world's meat. And again, if we have a look at coal, again, over half the world's coal. And if we look at steel, again, what we'll see is over half the world's steel. So there's a massive consumption already. If the populations, as we know, are projected to actually increase, and if we know that economically they're going to grow, there's going to be a rise in middle class, that consumption is likely to increase. And particularly things like meat, for example, which is linked to a middle class diet, is going to increase massively. It might be that actually there's a reduction in the consumption of coal, for example. So China, for example, is already the world's largest producer of solar panels. It's actually looking to decrease its carbon footprint. Is that actually something that will decrease in time? Presumably food will increase in terms of rice as well. Again, still, if China moves away from large infrastructure projects and construction program, will that fall as it becomes more developed? So it's not as simple as all resources will increase, but we can make educated guesses that there will be an increase for energy, maybe a decline in coal, but perhaps an increase in oil and gas. There will certainly be an increase in food, particularly meat, especially with China's rise in middle classes. Other issues like steel, other raw materials, we would assume will go up, but the pattern is more mixed. Now, if we look at some of the other resources, again, we can pick out certain things. Global food demand increasing to expect by 70 to 100%. That is going to be linked to this idea of nutrition transition. That's more and more meat, to be honest. Now, what that means is global food prices increase, global food shortages become more common. With a nutritional transition to a more Western diet, you can expect to see more diabetes, more heart disease. Well, that's quite worrying given India already has one of the highest rates of heart disease in the world. There's also the synoptic link here then to poverty in developing countries, because as food prices increase, they are the people who are least able to actually afford food. So we may well see greater food riots, famine possible in developing world. On the plus side, developing world will also benefit from higher food prices because they tend to be net exporters of primary products. So again, there's a complex pattern there and will vary from country to country. Certainly, the World Bank has just published information which suggests that any major food crisis economically will hit India and China more than any other country, simply because of their large population and projected increases in food imports. Now, there is also a issue here in terms of water security, and that's good because it allows you to make a synoptic link. If you have a look, what you'll see is that increase in food means a massive increase in fresh water, particularly in the developing countries where they have very little in the way of technology. Actually, water supplies can make 90% of the food supply can use up to 90% of the water supply. That, therefore, suggests bigger and bigger problems. However, we're all looking at two countries here which are becoming more economically developed. Is there also a tech fix here? Can they, for example, move to drip irrigation? Can that technology be spread to Africa? And we know, for example, China in particular is investing heavily. Does that investment also include the technology to make food production more efficient? Again, there are discussions there to be had that you can explore if you're going for really high grades. Now, another synoptic issue is this, energy security. We look at this, we see 30 to 60% increase by 2050, but notice the caveat, depending on population, GDP growth, efficiency measures and new technology. So basically there's a discussion there about how reliable that figure is. It's probably a best guess. Much of this demand comes from China and India, but we do know that in particular India has invested massively in renewables. You've got the Three Gorges Dam, you've got, as we've talked already, it's been the largest producer of solar power. So there are serious issues and consequences here of this energy increase in terms of demand, accelerating peak oil, increasing the price of oil, and again, that has pluses and minuses. For some countries, Nigeria, for example, a massive exporter of oil, increasing oil prices has got to be a good thing. Other countries which are not energy secure, take for example, I don't know, Mali for example, they're going to suffer as the price of imports increases. You also have to think about how this is going to do again on the global population consumption, and that's something that comes out in view 1. And again, some nice figures here of food, water and energy all increasing, and linking that again to this idea of an expanding middle class. We'll come and talk about climate change on the next slide. Now, it's worth considering climate change on its own because I think it's such a significant issue here. If you have a look, there's two things. First of all, what you will see is that China in particular is projected to make the largest increase in CO2 emissions between now and 2030. India, far less significant, although there is a small but steady increase. Now, it's the consequences of this which are really important. And what's interesting is that the effects aren't evenly distributed. So although China is the larger producer of CO2, it doesn't suffer as much. And if you have a look, what you can actually see is that China is predicted to increase by about 1.6 to 2 degrees by and large. Some bits even less, about a degree, degree and a half. Now, I have to say, a 2-degree increase is substantial and will have substantial impacts in terms of food production, water security, biodiversity, flooding, natural hazards and everything. But in comparison to India, India suffers more. And if you have a look, what you'll actually see is that some parts of India are actually projected to have over 3 degrees. Now, if we're saying 2 degrees is basically the maximum that mankind is allowed to get to without causing catastrophic consequences, 3 degrees, and you start thinking, well, actually, this is not good. Particularly since you've then got to think about the capacity to cope. And China does have far more capacity, a much larger economy, has a more educated population. Has China therefore got the ability to cope with that? That's slightly less significant increase compared to India, with its vast poverty, its smaller GDP, more rural population. Actually, what are the consequences for that? That's an important question. It's also worth thinking about water security. both of these countries are dependent on monsoon rains. Both of these countries are dependent on rivers which flow from the Himalayas, and for example, with the Ganges in particular, which go through a number of countries. That allows you, as a geographer, to then bring in a really interesting synoptic issues and to actually link into other transboundary water issues you've looked at, whether that be, for example, Gaza Strip and Israel, or whether that be the Nile. So there's some really interesting geography here you can pick out. You can also talk about food. You can talk about just general problems in terms of flooding, natural hazards, for example. You may even bring in the idea of El Nino and the fact that during El Nino, India in particular suffers from drought. There's lots here that you can get your teeth into. So really important consequences, and consequences in the most negative of senses, I'm afraid. So to conclude, if you get a question on the consequences of growth, it's important that you actually remember that there are substantial positives and there are negatives. And you want to think about making sure you've got a balanced argument. In terms of positives, probably the most important one here is actually the reduction of poverty, particularly in India. We can see how increasing GDP, increasing investment in education, health, for example, could have a significant impact on particularly the rural poor, but also looking at some of the groups, for example, like the Dalits, for example, who would benefit from that. There are some interesting geopolitical impacts, for example. So, for example, does this actually mean that USA's global dominance is going to be challenged? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on your view, I suppose. Certainly, these countries are going to gather in greater political power. And, for example, you could even look at, does this actually mean that India becomes so powerful it becomes worthy of a place in the UN Security Council? There's going to be increasing trade. There'll be increased prices of raw materials, a negative and a positive. But will there be more investment, for example, in Africa and low-income countries? So it's not all bad on a global scale. A really interesting one is, again, will this lead to increasing democracy? Modernists like Parsons argues it will do. But we saw with Tiananmen Square that could easily lead to internal conflict. So it's worth thinking about some of these go hand in hand, that there's sort of positives and negatives attached with them. When we look at the negatives, probably the most significant is the climate change. That 2-3 degrees increase in India and China will have massive consequences. And those consequences allow you to be synoptic. So you can talk about water insecurity, you can talk about energy insecurity, and some of the issues to do with the use of fossil fuels, for example. Food insecurity comes into it, and the sort of biodiversity consequences of climate change, of increasing food production. It's going to be absolutely substantial. So again, you can be synoptic. We've talked about increased conflict in terms internally, but we've also looked at the role of China's Blue Water Fleet, the South China Sea and the conflicts there, and the sort of growing military threat to USA's dominance. And perhaps one of the more interesting ones is what happens to India and China's sort of government policies. Do they need to change as the country becomes more globalised? And an interesting bit there is to have a look at those sort of pro-poor policies in India, the sort of subsidies, and think about how they're likely to change and whether those changes are positive. And a neoliberalist would argue that they are, that greater free trade, greater TNC involvement, greater industry, greater competition, all this can do is bring greater wealth and jobs and benefits from that trickle-down policy. Or does it actually mean that the poorest have their subsidies, have their food, have their energy subsidies taken away from them? That the collapse of Indian industry, which is not competing on a level playing field with global industry, does that mean that people lose their jobs? So there's an interesting discussion to be had there. It's interesting that if you look, you may well argue that actually the negatives, are they more global in scale? Climate change, certainly, the water insecurity, the food insecurity, these are very much global issues. Whereas perhaps when we look at the actual positives, they tend to be more national. Reduction of poverty in India, for example, democracy in China, although even some of these are are sort of global in scale, but that's something you might want to consider in your conclusion. So come to the end of this, it's worth thinking about what to do next. Very easy way to do this is to use this sort of information here, create a sort of table of advantages, disadvantages, do it for China, do it for India. You may even want to think about that as a 16-mark question, have a go at that, perhaps plan it, write it if you want, and email it in to us. But I hope you found this useful. Feel free to use this, email us if there's any questions, and have a go at taking on some of the questions and get that to us, and we look forward to it. Okay, that's it for now.